Story 1. It started as a normal evening, the kind where the hum of my laptop and the steady click of my keyboard filled the quiet of my home office. I was sifting through emails, lost in the monotony of work, when something caught my eye, a tiny detail, insignificant at first, but enough to send a ripple of unease through me. My desktop wallpaper had changed. It wasn't just any image, it was a picture of my backyard. The same backyard I had photographed months ago while tending to my garden. I remembered taking that photo, but I was certain I hadn't set it as my wallpaper. In fact, I hadn't changed my desktop background in weeks. I stared at the screen, my stomach knotting. Had I done this absent-mindedly? Maybe a system update had reset my settings. I moved to change it back, but the option was gone. The ability to alter my wallpaper had vanished, as if it had never existed. A cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. I forced myself to breathe, pushing away the creeping panic. Maybe it was a glitch. I ran a virus scan, checked my security settings, but everything appeared normal. No unauthorized access, no suspicious activity. And yet, the photo remained. A quiet, constant presence, staring back at me. Something felt off. I searched my computer for the original image, expecting to find it somewhere, my cloud storage, my photo library, but it wasn't there. It was gone. Like it had never existed. I told myself I was overthinking. That night, I double-checked the locks, glanced out the window more times than I'd like to admit, and eventually convinced myself to go to bed. But sleep never truly came. Every rustling branch outside, every distant creak of the house sent my thoughts spiraling. Had I heard something in the yard recently? A rustling? Footsteps? A camera shutter clicking in the dark? The next morning, I took action. I installed security cameras around my property, determined to catch anything out of the ordinary. I combed through the backyard, searching for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. No footprints. No disturbances. For a few days, life carried on, though unease clung to me like a second skin. The wallpaper never changed again, but the longer it stayed, the worse it became. Every time I opened my laptop, it felt like a silent message. A warning. Then I checked the security footage. Most of it was normal, just the usual stillness of my backyard. But as I scrolled through the timeline, something made my heart stop. A shadow moved. It was subtle. Quick. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. Near the edge of the frame, just beyond the reach of the motion-activated lights. I replayed it over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move like a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something, watching. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Someone had been in my yard. They had been close enough to see me. To hear me. And maybe, just maybe, close enough to take a picture. My paranoia deepened. I couldn't focus on work. Every time I turned on my laptop, I half expected the wallpaper to change again, to show me something worse. But days passed, then weeks. The image never changed. Until it did. One morning, groggy from another restless night, I flipped open my laptop and froze. The backyard photo was gone. In its place was a new image. A picture of me. Standing by my back door. Taken from a distance. My breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled. I didn't remember anyone taking this photo. I didn't remember standing there. And yet, there I was. Caught in a frame. Vulnerable. Unaware. My mind raced. Whoever had been watching me wasn't just lurking in the shadows. They had access to my laptop. My files. My life. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. I called a professional to secure my devices, changed all my passwords, and did everything I could to lock down my digital footprint. But deep down, I knew none of it would be enough. Because some things don't leave. Even now, I feel it. The weight of unseen eyes. The quiet presence in the dark corners of my home. Every time I close my laptop, every time I glance toward the backyard, the same thought returns. What if they're still out there? What if this was only the beginning? Story 2. I had just returned home from a long, exhausting day at work, my limbs heavy with fatigue and my mind clouded with the longing for nothing more than a quiet evening. As I stepped into my apartment, the familiar hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, a mundane sound that I had never really noticed before. But tonight, everything felt different. Off. I made my way into the kitchen, letting muscle memory guide me as I reached for the fridge handle. The cold air rushed out, brushing against my face as I scanned the shelves for something to eat. And then, I stopped. My breath hitched in my throat. On the top shelf, neatly stacked in an almost unsettling precision, were several black plastic containers. Sleek, with tight-fitting lids, they stood in stark contrast to my usual mismatched Tupperware. A creeping unease crawled up my spine. I didn't own these. I had never seen them before. I frowned, trying to piece together a logical explanation. Had I absent-mindedly picked them up during my last grocery run? No, that didn't make sense. I would have remembered buying something like this. And yet, here they were, filled with food that I did not recognize. Hesitantly, I reached for one of the containers. It was heavier than I expected. I pried the lid open, and the rich scent of pasta and tomato sauce wafted up. My stomach growled involuntarily, but something about it felt wrong. The sauce was too thick, almost gelatinous, and the pasta looked as though it had been cooked far too long, swollen and limp. I swallowed hard and reached for another container. This one held rice and some kind of meat. But the rice clumped together unnaturally, a sticky mass that reminded me more of glue than grains. The meat, dark and glossy, looked tender, too tender. As if it had been stewing for days. My chest tightened. This wasn't my food. This wasn't my doing. The kitchen felt suddenly too quiet, the stillness pressing in around me. I turned slowly, scanning the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But I was alone. Wasn't I? Maybe someone had brought the food over, a neighbor or a friend. But no, no one had been in my apartment. No one had a spare key. I lived alone. A cold sweat broke out across my skin as my mind raced through the possibilities, each one more absurd than the last. A prank? A mistake? But there was no sign of forced entry, no misplaced items to suggest someone had been inside. I closed the fridge door with a soft click, trying to suppress the unease tightening around my ribs. My own home suddenly felt foreign, as if I had stepped into a slightly altered version of my reality, one where something was just off. Needing answers, I hurried to my living room and pulled up my security camera footage. My heart pounded as I scrubbed through the recordings, eyes darting across the screen, searching for anything, that might explain what was happening. And then I saw it. A shadow. Just at the edge of the frame. It passed by my front door quickly, so quickly that if I hadn't been looking for it, I might have dismissed it as a trick of the light. But it was there. Tall. Unfamiliar. Carrying something. I rewound the footage, watching it over and over, my breath growing shallow. The figure never fully stepped into view, never revealed itself. It was as if it knew exactly where the blind spots were, as if it had done this before. I felt sick. Who had been in my home? And more importantly, why? My gaze flickered back toward the kitchen, the knowledge settling over me like ice. Those containers. They were left here. Placed deliberately. Not stolen, but given. I couldn't let them stay. My hands shook as I grabbed each one, dumping them unceremoniously into the trash, the lid snapping shut with finality. It felt like an exorcism, a desperate attempt to rid my home of whatever presence had wormed its way inside. As I closed the trash bin, a strange relief washed over me. The kitchen was quiet again. Normal. But deep down, I knew that whatever had happened tonight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Story 3. I was cleaning my desk when I found it, tucked beneath a mess of papers, a small note, folded neatly, almost too neatly. Something about it felt familiar, but I couldn't place why. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, unfolding the delicate crease. The moment I saw the handwriting, my heart stuttered. It was mine. The same loops, the same slanted curves, I had written this. And yet, I had no memory of doing so. Don't forget 3 a.m. The words sat there, stark against the page. I stared at them, willing some distant recollection to surface. But there was nothing. Just a hollow gap in my memory where this note should have been. Why had I written this? What was I supposed to remember? I glanced at the clock. 8 p.m. A few hours until the ominous time. The message pulsed in my mind, refusing to let go. Maybe it was an old reminder, something from a half-forgotten task. Maybe I had scribbled it down absent-mindedly and left it buried beneath the clutter. But if that were true, why did I feel like I had just unearthed something I was never meant to find? I tried to push the unease aside, but it gnawed at me. I had no plans that night, no reason to be awake at such an ungodly hour. Yet the note felt deliberate. Urgent. As if the words themselves carried weight beyond their meaning. I told myself I was being ridiculous. That it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't just a reminder. It was a warning. By 10 p.m., paranoia had sunk its claws into me. The note refused to be forgotten, sitting on my desk like an open wound. Every time I looked away, I swore I could feel its presence, watching me. I tried to distract myself, TV, a book, my phone. Nothing worked. The words burrowed deeper, like a whisper at the back of my skull. I found myself checking the locks. First the front door, then the windows. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the deadbolt, ensuring it was secure. The night outside was thick, suffocating. Every shadow seemed too deep, too still. Why did I feel like I was waiting for something? Midnight. I tried to sleep. I really did. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the note. I saw 3 a.m. burning into the darkness behind my eyelids. My body refused to relax, tense with a fear I couldn't name. It felt like a countdown. Tick. Tock. The weight of time pressed on my chest. The more I fought it, the more certain I became, I had to stay awake. 2:59 a.m. I sat in my living room, phone in hand, heart pounding as I watched the seconds crawl toward that dreaded moment. The apartment was eerily silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, 3 a.m. For a moment, nothing happened. No strange noises. No shadows moving in the corners of my vision. Just the hum of my own pulse, loud in the quiet. I let out a breath, a soft, almost embarrassed chuckle bubbling up in my throat. I had let a stupid note get inside my head. And then... scratch. A faint sound. Soft, deliberate. Coming from the front door. I froze. My fingers clenched around the armrest of the couch. The sound came again, a gentle tapping, a slow, dragging scratch. Someone was out there. No. Something. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. Every hair on my body stood on end as I forced myself to move. Step by step, I crept toward the door, each footfall feeling deafeningly loud in the stillness. The scratching continued. Closer. Louder. I reached for the doorknob with a shaking hand. Turned it. The door creaked open to reveal nothing. Just the empty hallway beyond. But then I saw it. Lying on the floor, just beyond the threshold, was another note. I bent down, pulse hammering against my ribs. My fingers closed around the paper, unfolding it with slow, deliberate movements. My breath caught in my throat. You forgot. A chill rippled through me. Forgot what? Panic rose like bile in my throat. I hadn't forgotten anything. I had stayed awake, I had watched, I had waited. So why did it say that? I spun around, the apartment suddenly feeling too dark, too wrong. And then, the door behind me creaked open on its own. The air turned ice cold. My skin prickled. I wasn't alone. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I turned, slowly, unwillingly. There, standing in my doorway, was a figure. Tall. Still. Shadowed. Watching me. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But I felt it. The room seemed to constrict around me, the air turning heavy, suffocating. My breath clouded in the cold. My legs trembled. And then, as if pulled by invisible strings, it stepped forward. Story 4. The morning started like any other, but something was off. That hazy moment between sleep and wakefulness felt heavier, like I had woken up in a world slightly different from the one I had fallen asleep in. I reached for my phone, my fingers sluggishly gliding across the screen, expecting nothing more than the usual morning routine. But then I saw it. A call log entry I didn't recognize, a 30-minute call with an unknown number. I blinked. My breath caught in my throat. The call had happened while I was asleep. My first thought was simple disbelief. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe my half-asleep brain was misreading things. But the timestamp was clear, 2 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. A cold, creeping unease settled in. I hadn't made any calls. I would have remembered making a half-hour call in the dead of night, right? I tapped on the number, hoping for some clue, some name, some location. Nothing. Just a string of digits with no attached information. No missed texts. No notifications. No record of anything other than that single, inexplicable call. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I dialed the number. It rang once. Then twice. Then, without warning, it cut to voicemail. A voice, cold and mechanical, came through the speaker. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. It was too crisp. Too rehearsed. It didn't sound like the usual automated messages, it sounded intentional. A slow chill worked its way up my spine. Something was wrong. I set my phone down, trying to calm the unease bubbling inside me. But then, another realization hit me like a freight train. The call wasn't just in my log. My phone had been unlocked at the time it happened. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. I never left my phone unlocked when I went to sleep. I had a passcode. I had Face ID. And yet, somehow, someone had unlocked it, and made that call. I swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. My room felt too quiet. Too still. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker. Was someone in my house last night? I bolted out of bed, checking every lock, every window, every door. All secured. Nothing looked out of place. But that only made it worse. If no one broke in, then how did my phone get unlocked? I called my service provider, grasping for any kind of logical explanation. Maybe they could trace the number. Maybe they could tell me something that made sense. But all they told me was that the call had definitely been made from my phone. No spoofing. No external access. No errors. I hung up, the cold weight of fear settling deep into my gut. I told myself it was just some weird, unexplainable glitch. But I didn't believe it. And 2 nights later, I learned the truth. I had set up a security camera just outside my bedroom. Just to ease my mind. Just to prove to myself that nothing was happening. But when I checked the footage the next morning, I saw it. At exactly 2 a.m., the moment the call was made, something moved outside my bedroom door. A figure. Tall. Motionless. Standing in the dim glow of the hallway. I felt my stomach drop. They weren't moving. Just watching. I leaned closer, my breath shallow. The figure stayed there for a full minute, completely still, just feet away from where I slept. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the darkness. I played the footage back over and over, hoping, praying, for some kind of distortion, some flaw that would explain what I was seeing. But it was real. Someone had been inside my home. They had unlocked my phone. They had made the call. And the worst part? They knew exactly when to come. Exactly where to stand. As if they had been watching me all along. I sat there, frozen in terror, staring at the screen as realization settled in. Whoever they weren't done with me yet. Story 5. I had just gotten home after a long, exhausting day. My mind was cluttered with 1,000 little thoughts, work, errands, the usual humdrum of life. As I stepped into the kitchen, I instinctively reached for my bag, ready to toss my keys onto the counter like I always did. But when I opened the bag, my fingers met only the worn fabric lining. My keys weren't there. A small flicker of confusion passed through me, but I brushed it off. Maybe I had put them in a different pocket. I started digging, my hands searching with growing urgency. Nothing. My breath caught slightly as I stood there, trying to recall the exact moment I had last held them. My mind felt foggy, as if the memory had already slipped through my fingers like grains of sand. Maybe I left them in my coat. Or maybe in the car. I checked the pockets of my jacket, which lay draped over the chair. I rummaged through my bag again, this time more frantically. Still nothing. And then, I saw them. They were sitting neatly on the kitchen counter. Right in front of me. A slow chill crept up my spine. My first instinct was to assume I had absent-mindedly put them there earlier, but something felt off. I was certain I hadn't placed them there. I would have remembered, wouldn't I? My mind reeled, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I was just overtired, a little scattered after a long day. That made sense, didn't it? I picked up the keys, turning them over in my palm. They felt normal. No scratches, no sign of being moved by anyone else. Yet, the air in the room felt different, heavier, colder. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch just a little too far, curling at the edges like dark fingers reaching for something unseen. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. I was just being ridiculous. It was nothing. Just a small lapse in memory. That's all. But as the evening went on, I found myself glancing at the counter, over and over, as if expecting the keys to disappear again. The thought clung to me, sinking into the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. I tried to distract myself with dinner, television, mindless scrolling through my phone. But when I finally crawled into bed, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The keys. Sitting there. Waiting. The next morning, it happened again. I woke up, went about my routine, and when I entered the kitchen, my stomach dropped. There they were. Sitting in the exact same spot on the counter. I stood frozen in the doorway, my pulse pounding in my ears. No. I was sure, absolutely sure, I had put them in my bag the night before. I had checked, double-checked. This wasn't me being forgetful. This wasn't absent-mindedness. Something was wrong. A slow, gnawing dread coiled in my chest. Had someone been in my house? The idea made my skin crawl. But that wasn't possible. I had locked the doors. The windows were secure. No one could have gotten in. And yet, the keys had moved. Or had they been moved? I needed to be sure. I placed them back on the counter, deliberately, carefully, marking their exact position. Then, with a deep breath, I left the room. I waited. And waited. When I finally gathered the courage to return, my throat tightened. They were gone. My stomach lurched. I frantically searched the kitchen, checking every drawer, every surface. Nothing. My keys had vanished as if they had never been there at all. My breathing grew shallow. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't mistaken. Someone, or something, was moving them. But why? And how? That night, I set up a camera in the kitchen. I needed proof. I needed to know. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see, but I had to try. I positioned the camera to face the counter and went to bed, my heart hammering with anticipation and unease. The next morning, I hesitated before checking the footage. My fingers trembled as I played it back. At first, nothing. Just an empty kitchen, silent and still. Then, about an hour after I had left the room, it happened. The keys moved. They slid across the counter. Slowly at first, almost hesitantly, inching toward the edge. And then, with a sudden jerk, they vanished. There was no hand. No shadow. No sign of anyone touching them. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. I had no explanation. No logical reason for what I had just witnessed. But one thing was certain. I wasn't alone in my house. And whatever was here, it wasn't finished yet. Story 6. It had been a long, exhausting day. All I wanted was to get home, kick off my shoes, and let the quiet of my apartment wash over me. The city outside was alive with its usual hum, a comforting backdrop as I stood in the dimly lit lobby, waiting for the elevator. When the doors slid open with a metallic groan, I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. The moment the doors shut, something shifted. It was subtle, like the air had thickened, as if the walls had drawn just a little closer. The descent started smoothly, a gentle hum vibrating beneath my feet. But as we passed the second floor, the elevator lurched, jerking to a sudden stop. My stomach flipped. I glanced at the display panel, expecting to see a floor number I recognized. Instead, the screen flickered, stuttering between garbled symbols before settling on something impossible, SUB basement. I frowned. That couldn't be right. There was no sub-basement in this building, at least, not one that I had ever heard of. I had worked here for years, memorized every level, yet this one didn't exist. I pressed the button for the ground floor again. Nothing. The lights flickered, just once, before the elevator resumed its slow, deliberate descent. My pulse quickened. A weight pressed down on my chest, an inexplicable dread curling around me like a cold breath against my neck. Then, with a low ding, the doors slid open. A dimly lit hallway stretched before me, long and narrow. The walls were cracked and stained, the air thick with the scent of damp concrete and something stale, something old. Fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting harsh shadows that seemed to twitch when I wasn't looking directly at them. I stayed in the elevator, my hand hovering over the buttons. I jabbed at them again, nothing. The elevator didn't respond. It wasn't letting me leave, not the way I wanted to. My only option was forward. With reluctant steps, I stepped into the hallway. The silence swallowed me whole. There were no signs, no doors, just the oppressive weight of the corridor stretching in either direction. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, thick with something unseen but deeply felt. I wasn't alone. I reached a door at the very end of the hall. Rusted metal, chipped paint, a handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. And yet, when I turned it, it yielded with an unsettling ease. Inside, an abandoned office lay frozen in time. Dust coated every surface, filing cabinets, desks, shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten documents. The air was stagnant, untouched. I stepped further in, drawn by a strange familiarity I couldn't place, as if I had been here before in some half-forgotten dream. A desk in the corner held a thick, dust-covered file. My fingers trembled as I lifted the cover, revealing brittle pages filled with fragmented notes, reports blacked out with heavy ink, and faded photographs. 3 words stood out on the cover, barely legible beneath the grime. Project 47. A cold shiver ran through me. The words meant nothing, yet they filled me with a nameless dread. Then, a noise behind me. I spun, heart hammering. Nothing. The room was empty. But the silence had changed. It was no longer passive, it was listening. Another noise. Closer this time. A scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I swallowed hard, my body frozen in place. My breath came fast and shallow as I forced myself to turn again. And then, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't there before. It stood at the far end of the room, shifting, stretching, twisting into something almost human but not quite. It didn't walk, it bled forward, dissolving and reforming with every step. It was watching me. I tried to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. My mind screamed, but my body remained locked in place, paralyzed by a fear so primal it rooted me to the spot. Then, it spoke. The voice was deep, resonant, vibrating through my bones rather than my ears. You shouldn't have come. The words clawed at my mind, sending a wave of nausea rolling through me. My vision blurred. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up from whatever nightmare this was. When I opened them, the shadow was gone. The room was empty once more, the silence deafening. I ran. Out of the office, down the corridor, my footsteps pounding against the concrete. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly in both directions. I gasped for air, panic flooding my veins. My only hope was the elevator, I had to make it back. When I reached it, I slammed the button, praying, pleading. The doors groaned open, and I stumbled inside, jabbing at the button for the main floor. This time, mercifully, the elevator obeyed. As it ascended, I forced myself to breathe, to steady my shaking hands. When the doors finally slid open, the sight of the familiar lobby nearly brought me to my knees. People bustled past me, oblivious to the terror that clung to my skin. I turned back to the elevator, expecting, dreading, to see the button-marked SUB basement still illuminated. But it was gone. I checked the directory the next day. There was no sub-basement. No record of one ever existing. The building manager swore up and down that I must have imagined it. A glitch, a power surge, stress, he had plenty of explanations, none of which made sense. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that whatever was down there, it did not want me to leave. But somehow, I had. And I don't think it was finished with me. Story 7. I woke up to the soft golden light of dawn spilling through the curtains, casting long, quiet shadows across the walls. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, the kind of peace that lingers in the haze of sleep before reality settles in. The house was still, almost unnervingly so. I stretched, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet meeting the cool wooden floor. And that's when I noticed it. The air had a sharp bite, colder than it should have been. A chill snaked up my spine as I turned my head and saw it, my bedroom window, wide open. The sheer curtains billowed ever so slightly in the morning breeze. My stomach clenched. I had locked that window. I was sure of it. I always locked it. Heart pounding, I threw off the blankets and rushed through the house. Every window, living room, kitchen, bathroom, stood open, gaping like silent mouths. The crisp morning air carried an eerie stillness, an unnatural quiet that made my breath catch in my throat. This didn't make sense. I had gone through my usual nighttime routine before bed, checked the locks, secured every window, ensured everything was as it should be. And yet, here they were, all open as if someone had carefully, deliberately undone each latch in the dead of night. Panic clawed at my chest. I scanned every room, searching for any sign of forced entry, but there was nothing. No broken glass, no scratches on the locks, no footprints on the floor. Everything else was exactly as I had left it. Whoever, or whatever, had done this had moved silently, methodically, without disturbing a single thing. I slammed the windows shut one by one, each lock clicking into place with a sound that should have reassured me. It didn't. The rest of the morning passed in a blur, but the unease never faded. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak in the house louder. My nerves were frayed, my mind racing through impossible explanations. Maybe I had simply forgotten to lock them. No. No, I knew better than that. As the day stretched on, an oppressive weight settled over me, a presence that clung to the walls and lurked in the corners of my vision. By evening, I had convinced myself that fresh air would help. A walk, just a short one, to clear my head. But even outside, the feeling of being watched never left. It was a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a whisper of movement just beyond my peripheral vision. I forced myself to shake it off, to keep moving, but I could feel it, something, someone, just beyond reach. I hurried home, locking the door behind me with trembling fingers. My breathing was uneven as I checked every window again. Secure. Locked. Safe. And yet, when I reached my bedroom, my heart nearly stopped. The window was open again. A bolt of cold fear shot through me. I had locked it before I left. I had been sure of it. And yet there it stood, yawning wide, the curtains shifting ever so slightly as if someone had just been there. I tore through the house, checking every other window. Open. 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 I felt sick. Whoever had done this, they weren't just opening the windows. They were coming back. And they wanted me to know it. The next morning, I awoke with a jolt, my breath ragged before my mind even caught up. My pulse pounded in my ears as I sat up and scanned the room. Every window was open again. I slammed them shut, locking them tighter than before. This wasn't some coincidence, some lapse in memory. It was intentional. Desperate for answers, I bought security cameras that day, installing them at every entry point. If someone was sneaking into my home, I would catch them. That night, as I climbed into bed, I felt a small sense of relief. This would end. I would have proof. But the next morning, when I checked the footage, my blood ran cold. There was nothing. No movement. No figures. No sign of anyone. The cameras had recorded only the stillness of the night, uninterrupted, unbroken. And yet, the windows had opened again. I felt myself unraveling. How? How was this happening? That evening, as I prepared for bed, my hands trembled when I checked the locks one final time. My nerves were frayed, my body exhausted, but sleep was impossible. I laid there in the dark, listening, waiting, dreading. Then I saw it. A faint outline on the bedroom window, just visible in the moonlight. A handprint. Small, delicate, pressed against the glass from the outside. The breath fled from my lungs. Someone had been here. Someone had stood right outside my window, watching me. I scrambled for my phone, dialing the police with shaking fingers. When they arrived, they found nothing. No footprints outside. no fingerprints on the glass. No signs of a break-in. But I knew better. That night, sleep never came. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body coiled tight. The wind outside howled louder than usual, rattling the walls, seeping under the cracks of the door. And then I saw it. A small piece of paper, taped to the inside of my window. My stomach dropped as I sat up, my pulse a deafening drum in my ears. With slow, deliberate movements, I reached out and peeled the note from the glass. In neat, careful handwriting, it read, "You're not alone." I couldn't breathe. Whoever was doing this, they weren't just watching me. They knew I was watching them, too. Story 8. The night was calm, too calm. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making every tiny sound feel deafening. It was the kind of quiet that made you uneasy, like something was just out of sight, watching, waiting. I had finished dinner not long ago, a simple meal that now felt like a distant memory. Sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, I tried to ignore the nagging sense of unease that had settled in my chest. The dim glow of the lamp beside me cast long, stretched shadows across the walls, and the air felt cooler than it should have. I kept glancing toward the window. I didn't know why. Something about it felt off tonight, like the darkness outside was heavier than usual. My mind tried to rationalize it, but my gut told me something was wrong. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. Then, I heard it. Click. A soft, mechanical sound, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. My breath hitched. I froze, my fingers tightening around my phone. Had I imagined it? Maybe it was the house settling, or a branch tapping against the glass. I almost let it go. Almost convinced myself it was nothing. Click. My stomach dropped. No, I wasn't imagining it. It was real. The sound was coming from outside. Slowly, cautiously, I stood, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Every step toward the window felt too loud, too exposed. I reached the curtain, hesitated, then carefully peeled it back just enough to see. My blood turned to ice. There, standing just outside on the porch, was a man. He was dressed in dark clothing, his features blurred by the shadows. But I could see what he was holding. A camera. He was taking pictures. Of me. He didn't seem to notice that I was watching. He just stood there, lifting the camera, snapping photo after photo, his movements slow and deliberate. My throat was dry, my limbs frozen in place. How long had he been there? How many pictures had he taken? And more terrifyingly, why? A sharp breath slipped from my lips, too loud in the quiet room. I stepped back, my mind racing. Call the police. Lock the doors. Do something. But my hands trembled too much to dial. My phone felt useless in my grip. I didn't want to move, didn't want to draw attention to the fact that I had seen him. Click. The sound sent shivers down my spine. He was still taking pictures. My stomach churned as I peeked again through the blinds, hoping, praying, that he was gone. He wasn't. He was closer. Right in front of the window. The lens of the camera pointed directly at me. A wave of nausea hit me. My skin prickled with fear, every nerve screaming at me to run, to hide. But I couldn't move. My feet felt cemented to the floor. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I reached for my phone again, this time managing to type out a message with shaking hands. Someone's outside. Taking pictures of me. I sent it to a friend. I didn't know what else to do. Locking the doors felt futile, but I did it anyway, my fingers fumbling with the deadbolt. I checked the windows, every single one, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The clicking didn't stop. Each one was like a needle pressing deeper into my skin. I tried to listen for footsteps, for any movement that signaled he was leaving. But all I could hear was the beating of my own heart. Then, silence. No more clicks. No more movement. I peered out the back window, half expecting to see him circling the house. But there was nothing. Just the empty yard bathed in darkness. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe he had left. Maybe it was over. But when I turned back to the front window, he was still there. Only now, he wasn't holding the camera. He stood motionless, the porch light casting a faint glow around him. His posture was different now. Less like a photographer capturing a moment. More like a predator waiting for the right time to strike. His head was slightly tilted, his body unnervingly still. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking at me. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. My phone vibrated in my hand, a response from my friend. But I didn't dare look away. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. Tap. 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 He was knocking. Not on the door. On the glass. I sucked in a sharp breath, my body locking up. The knock was gentle, almost polite. But there was no kindness in it. No urgency. Just a quiet acknowledgement that he knew I was there. That he had seen me, just as I had seen him. And he wasn't leaving. I backed into the shadows, pressing myself into the corner of the room, willing myself to disappear. My phone vibrated again. I needed to call the police. But my fingers wouldn't move, my body refusing to betray my position. Every instinct screamed at me to stay silent. Stay hidden. The minutes stretched into eternity. Then, finally, footsteps. Slow. Measured. Fading into the distance. I forced myself to wait, my ears straining for any hint that he was still there. But there was nothing. Only the suffocating quiet of the house around me. I don't remember how long I sat there before I finally dared to move. Before I forced myself to check the locks again, to peek out the window one last time. He was gone. But the fear remained. Lingering like a shadow that refused to leave. I filed a police report the next day. They weren't too concerned. Probably just some weirdo, they said. Someone with no real intent to harm. But I knew better. Because even now, whenever I sit in my living room, whenever the night is too quiet, too still, I can't shake the feeling. The feeling that someone is still watching. Story 9. It started with a single notification, just a quiet ping that I barely noticed. I assumed it was another random alert, nothing worth my attention. But when I unlocked my phone, my breath caught in my throat. An unknown contact. No name, no number. Just a message. Attached to it was a screenshot. At first, it seemed harmless. It was my work calendar, showing my completed tasks for the day, down to the exact minute. Confused, I frowned. I hadn't shared this with anyone. Then came the second screenshot. My grocery list, the one I had hastily jotted down that morning. My stomach twisted into knots. As I scrolled through the images, a chill settled deep into my bones. Whoever this was, they weren't just accessing my phone. They were tracking me. Documenting my life in real time. The messages kept coming, each screenshot more invasive than the last. My commute. My lunch order. My reflection in a store window. My heart pounded. I checked my apps, my messages, my emails. Nothing seemed out of place. No suspicious logins. No unfamiliar software. And yet, the screenshots kept arriving like clockwork, every hour, another glimpse into my life, captured from an unseen eye. I reset my phone, changed every password, logged out of everything. I convinced myself it was over. But the next morning, the messages resumed as if nothing had changed. Then, on the third day, the screenshots took a sinister turn. They no longer showed my digital life. They showed things I hadn't done yet. An image of my house from the outside, taken from multiple angles. A photo of my empty bedroom, captured as if someone had been standing at the door, watching me sleep. My skin prickled with horror. Someone had been inside. I called my phone carrier, desperate for answers. They found nothing unusual, no breaches, no signs of hacking. It's probably a glitch, they said, but I knew better. That night, I set up a camera in my bedroom. If someone was watching me, I was going to catch them. Sleep was impossible. My eyes remained fixed on the screen, waiting for another message. At exactly 12:03 a.m., my phone buzzed. A new screenshot. My blood ran cold. It was me. Lying in bed. Staring at my phone. But the angle. It was from above. A vantage point I could never have taken myself. A shadow loomed in the darkness of the image, barely visible. My pulse pounded in my ears as I forced myself to look up. The ceiling vent was ajar. I bolted out of my room, slamming the door shut behind me, heart hammering against my ribs. Someone was inside my house. Someone had been there, watching, waiting, crawling through the spaces I never thought to check. I called the police. They searched every inch of my home. The attic. The vents. The crawl spaces. They found nothing. No footprints. No evidence of forced entry. No sign that anyone had ever been there. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. One suggested I was experiencing paranoia, maybe exhaustion. It could be an elaborate prank, they offered, but I saw the doubt in their eyes. Who would believe that someone was using my phone to track me, without ever leaving a trace? That night, I packed a bag. I left my house, checked into a hotel, and changed my number. I switched phones, hoping, praying, that whatever had been happening would finally stop. For a few hours, there was silence. No notifications. No screenshots. Just the hum of the hotel's air conditioning and the distant murmur of voices from the hallway. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then my new phone buzzed. One last message. A single screenshot. The hotel hallway. The same one I had walked down earlier that evening. The image was taken from the far corner, as if someone had been standing there, watching me as I passed by. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. My heart pounded in my chest. I was no longer alone. Story 10. The road stretched out before me, long and empty, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting elongated shadows that twisted and stretched across the pavement. I had been driving for over an hour, no real destination in mind, just taking turns at random, letting the quiet hum of the tires against the road lull my thoughts into a wandering haze. It was a rare, peaceful evening, the kind that felt like a moment suspended in time, until I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A car was behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, it was just another vehicle on a mostly deserted road. Maybe we were simply heading in the same direction. No big deal. But then I made a sharp left, an impulsive, sudden decision, and the car followed. I frowned, glancing at my rearview mirror as I turned again, this time onto a narrower, less traveled road. The headlights behind me remained steady. No hesitation. A chill prickled at the back of my neck. I swallowed, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But I needed to be sure. I turned again, this time onto a winding, unfamiliar road, one that twisted through the outskirts of town where streetlights were sparse and houses stood far apart. The car followed. It was different now. Not just a fellow traveler on the road. This was deliberate. Intentional. Every lane change, every sharp turn I took, the car mirrored me perfectly, never faltering. I could feel the weight of its presence behind me, heavy and unrelenting. My heartbeat quickened. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. Was I imagining this? I made another turn, then another, each one sharper, more erratic, trying to shake them off. But no matter what I did, the car never wavered. It was like they knew what I was doing, like they anticipated my every move. My chest tightened. I decided to test them. I circled back, retracing my own path. If it was just a coincidence, they'd continue on their way. But they didn't. The headlights remained fixed in my rearview mirror, never drifting away, never giving me a moment's relief. The road was eerily quiet, the sky darkening, swallowing the last traces of daylight. I could feel the panic creeping in now, wrapping its icy fingers around my throat. I needed to lose them. My foot pressed harder against the gas pedal, the engine growling as I took another sharp turn, skidding slightly on the loose gravel of an old back road. But still, the headlights remained. Closer now. Watching. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I didn't know where I was anymore. The streets were unfamiliar, twisting in on themselves, leading me deeper into an area I didn't recognize. My hands trembled on the wheel. Then, suddenly, an idea. I made a split-second decision and veered off into an alleyway, my tires screeching as I took the turn too fast. My breath was shallow, my fingers aching from gripping the wheel so tightly. I dared a glance at the rearview mirror, expecting to see the car continuing down the main road, finally breaking away. But no. The headlights appeared at the entrance of the alley. They had followed me. My stomach turned. This wasn't random. This wasn't my imagination. Someone was following me. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, frustration and fear mixing in my chest like a slow-burning fire. My mind raced through possibilities. Who were they? What did they want? I hadn't done anything. Hadn't cut anyone off. Hadn't made anyone mad. And yet, they were still there. Finally, desperate, I pulled over, my breath coming in short gasps. Maybe if I stopped, they would pass by, and I could see their face. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was nothing. The car didn't stop. It didn't slow. It passed me, rolling silently through the darkened road, its headlights slipping over me like a cold breath against my skin. For a moment, I exhaled, relief flooding through my chest. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe they had just been heading the same way all along, and I had let my paranoia get the best of me. I watched as the taillights disappeared into the distance. And then, just as I reached for the gear shift, the headlights reappeared. The car had turned around. My breath hitched. It was coming back. A deep, primal fear settled in my bones. This is not normal. My hands shook as I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, speeding away, taking turns so fast I could feel the tires skid beneath me. My heart was hammering against my ribs, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get away. But no matter what I did, the car kept pace. No hesitation. No space between us. I didn't know where I was anymore, but I didn't care. All that mattered was escaping. Then, finally, I saw it. A main road. Traffic. Street lights. Civilization. I barreled forward, weaving into the lanes of other cars, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I couldn't see them anymore. I couldn't hear them. For a moment, I thought I had lost them. And then, as I reached a red light, my hands still trembling against the wheel, I glanced to my side. And there they were. A few spaces down. Waiting. They didn't look at me. Didn't move. The car sat there, humming softly, as if it had been there all along. Like it had waited for me. I didn't wait for the light to change. I slammed my foot down, taking the next turn hard, speeding home without looking back. By the time I reached my driveway, I felt like I couldn't breathe. My hands ached. My entire body was shaking. I slammed the garage door shut behind me, locking every door, checking the windows, again and again, until I was sure nothing could get in. But even now, as I sit here, my fingers still trembling as I type this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. That somewhere out there, in the quiet night, that car is still waiting. And that one day, it will find me again.